While we're waiting for a few more people to trickle in, um, make sure you keep an eye out in your inbox for part 2 of this webinar, which will be on July 23rd on Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes as we let people trickle in here. Thanks for joining us for this very important and relevant topic. I'm Chip St. Clair, I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Tyson Group, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. A few housekeeping items before we get rolling. First, all registrants will receive a recording of this webinar in the next couple of days, so keep an eye out for that. Secondly, we'll be recording this webinar. We'll be keeping this webinar short and sweet, 45 minutes, and we will reserve the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So please put any questions you may have in the Q&A section, and I'll be sure to field them for Lance. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, this is part 1 of a 2-part webinar. So mark your calendars for part 2, which will be on Tuesday, July 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. You will receive an email within the next few days with an invitation to sign up. So be on the lookout for that. For those who are unfamiliar with Tyson Group, we are an award-winning sales training and consulting firm that empowers clients to drive sales performance through strategy, leadership solutions, and skill development. And we service some of the biggest brands in the world. We are data-driven, results-oriented, and although we don't do it for the awards, they never hurt. Last year, we were named to the Inc. 5000 list as one of the fastest growing companies in America. So on to the reason we're here today. In this fast-paced world of sales, navigating the complexities of objections, negotiations, and closings can feel like wandering through a labyrinth sometimes. Maximize sales effectiveness with sales team science. Objections, negotiations, and closings, oh my. This is our webinar today. It's a 45-minute session designed to equip sales leaders, managers, and C-suite executives with the tools to confidently handle every stage of the sales process, from unpacking the art of listening, understanding, and responding to objections in a way that turns doubts into opportunities, to deconstructing the psychology of negotiation to empower your team to navigate even the toughest negotiations with ease, all while integrating principles of sales team science into every aspect of sales effectiveness. This session is going to be an indispensable resource for those aiming to elevate their team's performance and achieve groundbreaking results. Well, enough of me. To help us with our journey here to unpack this topic today in our webinar is best-selling author, Forbes, Inc. and Fast Company contributor, President and CEO of Tyson Group, Lance Tyson.
I appreciate it, Chip. Thanks, buddy. We're excited about today. And let's just kind of jump right into it. So, here's what's kind of interesting that we hear from salespeople. Number one, we're constantly hearing that salespeople and leaders are trying to increase sales productivity. I think anybody that's on here, whether you're a leader, an individual producer, I've yet to see in sales that sales are going down. We're dealing with an international truck firm that is a private equity driven organization. They have to grow double digits this year. We're with an MBA team 2 days ago where the sales leaders are really focused on how to have growth, dramatic growth. An NFL team has to grow by 20%, another one here in Ohio. So we know that's important. But what stops sales productivity is really cycle time. Because as we try to grow sales, we also have to look to take steps out. And we know for a fact that there is some confusion between negotiation and objections, and they actually collide. And I was at the an airport the other day, and I was looking at a competitor of ours who wrote a book on objections, and I picked it up. It was about 200 pages, and it was about 200 pages of tactics, really, about what to do in the moment. Today won't be about that at all. Today will be about the strategy and understanding where objections come from, and then as we have to deal with those objections, and you're going to hear me say this often, we're probably not going to deal with objections from here on out. We're going to resolve objections. That's a very big difference in objectives there. So how do we reduce sales cycle times? Because certainly objections in negotiations can extend them out like an accordion. And then ultimately, how do we get better close rates? And they can be close rates on anything, close rates on securing appointments to winning more deals, whatever it looks like in your world. Let's dive into this information. So here's a map of sales stages. So any one of you, I know we have some clients on here. We have some sports teams on here. We also have a tech company that I was talking to the other day. I know it's on this webinar. If we looked at sales stages in a semi-complex to complex sales world, most of you on here probably have to prospect. You have to reach out to somebody, have initial communication. Well, that's you following up with, you know, things that you would do individual prospecting or leads. You probably are going to have a first interview, very common nomenclature, needs analysis, right? Then you develop some kind of solution with the buyer, and then you actually present a solution. There's some kind of evaluation from the buyer. This can happen in multiple meetings. This could happen in a few meetings. This could happen in a one-time move. They're going to object after they evaluate. But then that's when the negotiations actually starts. So one thing you want to take out of this, and closing is closing, and we're going to talk about this. One thing you want to take, if you go to the bottom of those stages, right, the evaluation, the objections, and negotiation, you could ask yourself this question: where do objections come from? Well, you actually have to go to the stage before that. Objections typically come from some kind of presentation that's gone awry. Right? We say that evidence removes doubts. A good lawyer will present evidence. That evidence is used to remove doubt. You know, it's said, I think I said in one of my books, when you have the facts, you pound the facts. When you have the evidence, you pound the evidence. When you have neither, you just pound the desk, right? I think bottom line, if you're presenting the wrong information, though, you could actually be causing more objections. Now that affects negotiation down the line, affects your closing and things like that. Well, then you have to go the step before that. You have to look at how you develop the solution. And are you selling to a need? Are you selling to a primary need or a primary interest? Or are you selling to a secondary interest? Sometimes the right solution for the wrong problem is worse than the wrong solution to the right problem. So sometimes we got to get the problem or opportunity right. And then, you know, what a prospecting, initial communication, there's credibility issues and things like that. Now, we're going to come at this strategy a couple different ways. So if you came here just to worry about what to do in the moment when somebody gives you the price objection, you'll have to come to the next session on that, because we'll talk a little bit more about that. We categorize objections into a few things. First of all, we're going to talk to you about inherent objections. Objections are there because of the sales process and because of the buying process. Then we're going to get in our next webinar into a little bit more specific objections and some negotiation models. So let's move this forward. So when you're selling, what's the difference between resolving an objection and negotiating? That's the first question you need to ask yourself. And I mentioned it a little bit before. The question begets another question. Could you make a sale without negotiating? And the answer to that question is actually yes. I have Tyson Group was an Inc. 5000 company, which tells you one thing. We definitely know how to toot our own horn, but it also means we eat our own dog food. We practice actually what we preach. Being on the Inc. 5000 list actually means we grow at a pretty fast pace. And I would say the sellers on my team, whether it be Brandon Lawrence, whether it be John Schollenberger or Skylar Loud or Zach Tyson on our team, and Gina, who runs our team, Gina Beltrama, we're constantly debating with each other on approach. We're constantly debating with each other on strategy. And we're constantly looking at, are we getting negotiated or not? Is somebody making moves on us? So I think as you look at things is, geez, am I negotiating many times when I should have just resolved the objection? I would write this down. You can't bargain if you're blind, right? So you have to have a sight line. So you got to be able to identify objections. And does your sales process require you to identify what an objection is? And until you do that and identify the categories of objections, that's actually after you pitch, like I showed you in those stages. If you don't get them all laid out, you're going to kind of have issues at some level. So let's bring this a step further. Now, here's what's interesting about the word negotiation, though, as we tie these together, because some people got on this webinar because of the word negotiation, some got on it because of objections, and some got on it, they go, hey, maybe I don't even know what the difference is, right? So let's define some terms. Okay. First of all, as we think about negotiation, that really is around navigation, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. We're going to look at some more terms defined with navigation negotiation. That's then the next question you got to ask yourself is, as I'm selling, do I know the difference between a buying signal and a warning signal? Let me help you with that one right now. We'll go back to the first bullet point right after this. A buying signal is anything a buyer says or does, or doesn't say or doesn't do that indicates a level of interest. That's what a buying signal. And you'd be surprised how many salespeople never really given that any thought. If you can see me on camera, and if I'm standing across from you, or sitting across from you, and have my arms crossed you, proverbially speaking, what does that mean? Well, a lot of pundits would tell you that means, I'm not interested or I'm closed off. If I was across from you or on a Zoom call and I was rubbing my chin, what does that mean? Well, somebody said, well, geez, maybe Lance is thinking, maybe he's interested, or that could mean I just need a shave. So you got to admit some level, like, what is a buying or warning signal? And let's go to the warning signal. Warning signal is anything the buyer says or does, or anything the buyer says or doesn't say or doesn't do that would indicate some kind of hesitation to move forward. Well, all during the sales process, we have to be recognizing these things, because buying and warning signals would indicate a level of interest or disinterest. But then the question becomes, how do you actually not just observe them, but engage with those things? How do you talk about them? How do you, and some of that solution is, how good are you in your sales process at asking evaluative questions? They're essentially trial closes. Trial closes are evaluative questions, or questions that solicit an opinion. I might say something to Chip, like, Chip, it looks like you may be a little closed off to that idea, or it looks like it seems like or sounds like we're not hitting the mark on that. And he might say, that's right. So then objections themselves, right? There has to be a part of the sales process after pitch that we actually get those objections out. And then what is negotiation? Let's dive into the most difficult term. How do we know this is the difficult term? I'm going to run the risk of saying negotiation. The word negotiation is much like the word pornography. You're like, whoa, why is he saying that on a webinar? Well, hear me out. According to U.S. government versus Larry Flint, the Supreme Court identified pornography as in the eyes of the beholder. Okay. So it's not a very defined word. And I think negotiation in business is the same thing. When I ask leaders all the time, I say, hey, how would you define a good negotiator? They can list all the skill sets for me. Well, it's a person that holds the line. It's a person that has a strategy. If I said to most of you in negotiation, give me some rules with negotiation, a lot of you would say, well, don't go first. The first one that goes loses. Somebody else would say, don't, watch what you put in writing, right? It might come back to bite you. So that tells me the word negotiation is a little bit of a has a mask on it, right? It's undefined. People don't know what to do with it, right? But we're all asked to do that, whether we own a business, whether we're in sales, even leaders here. Just when you're offering somebody a job, you're negotiating at some level. So let's kind of dive into that. So if you looked at the Oxford Dictionary, it depends how you use the word negotiation. So as a verb without an object, negotiate it or negotiating means to deal or bargain with another or others as in preparation or definition for a contract, preliminaries into a business deal. I would say most of you probably do that here. I don't know if I want to use that definition yet. If it's a verb used with an object, negotiate it or negotiate in, to arrange to bring about a discussion or settlement of terms, like to negotiate a loan. Okay, I think all of us do that. Another definition could be to manage, transact, conduct. He negotiated an important business deal. All right, I think we do that. I do that. I think all my salespeople do all these. Most of the ones we coach do all these things. How about then look at that definition for to move through, around, and over in a satisfactory manner, to negotiate a difficult dance step without tripping, to negotiate a treaty. Or that last one, to transfer a draft or promising note to a new owner by endorsement or delivery or by delivery. I want you to focus on today, the fourth definition. I would say most of you, I'm at our office in Dublin, Ohio, and I drove my truck over here, and I can tell you I negotiated the traffic. Since I hit over 45, I try to take the steps wherever I can. So I walked up 2 flights of steps to get here. I negotiated through the office. I think what we have to worry about in sales is negotiation, by definition, is a navigation. Think about every time you start sales process, you are navigating, and a good sales process would be like a Waze app for you. So most of you that are here, I think I saw several people from the Milwaukee Bucks sign up for this. So probably some of them are out there. So shout out to the folks up there in Wisconsin. And I would say that, think about your sales process. Are you helping somebody navigate the buying journey? That's really our job. My salespeople do it. Any organization we deal with does that. So let's move on. Well, before you negotiate at all, I think there's some things we all probably should understand from a really baseline foundational piece. If we are going to resolve objections, and I want to keep using that word, if we are going to resolve objections properly, or we are going to negotiate a really heavy deal. So you might get some people on here that are negotiating big media deals, 6-figure, 7-figure deals. Well, your ability to understand your client or prospect probably becomes pretty critical. It's said in sales, probably the most word used is the word relationship. I would argue at some level, that's more of a filtering word that actually stops a lot of us from doing what we need to do, because we're so worried about building a relationship. And I think you need to ask yourself, is it more important you build a relationship or sell something? And I think sell something is probably the modus operandi. And secondly, I would also argue with most of you, I think what you're trying to have with people is rapport. A lot of people sell here have products that are disruptors, have products that are and early in the sales process and late in the sales process. Some of the things that are said and done, or some of the moves, may look like things that could hurt the relationship. So I think you should be worried about having a healthy rapport with people, because that yields a level of influence. And then I think in everything you do, as long as it's not illegal, immoral, and ethical, especially in business, you have to have credibility, and your credibility is based on, how things appear, who you are as a person. Probably the last thing you'll be judged on is your soul, but credibility yields trust, which is a level of persuasiveness, and influence and persuasion are two very different things. I wrote about them in my book, The Human Sales Factor. When I started to write that book and thinking of negotiation and thinking about selling, I thought they were synonyms, persuasion and influence. And you know what? They're not synonyms. Influence is based off who you are from a character standpoint. Like, think about it. A lot of you have gotten accused maybe by your parents or whoever raised you that so-and-so is John's a bad influence on you, Shannon's a bad influence on you, or maybe you are a bad influence on them. Well, that's different. That's how you behave as a person. Your credibility is persuading by argument or process, right? And do you have a predictable sales process that yields a predictable result? One of our salespeople, John Schollenberger, does business with a construction supply company. And we look a lot at a concept called, especially when we're negotiating, selling a concept called red ocean strategy or blue ocean strategy. There's a book out there you should read on that. And many products or services either fall on a blue or red ocean. Very quickly, by definition, blue ocean would be a product, service, or a business that exists where there's not a ton of competition. The marketplaces are very deep, very open, a lot of oxygen in the water. Most organizations compete in a world that's a red ocean. It's shallow. There's not as many fish. There's a more finite marketplace. Competition is tough. And as we were talking to John's customer in this space, they're number one in the country in their region. They're one of the better, stronger brands. But competition's more stiff now. They're fighting for budgets and things like that. As we were working with this gentleman, he was convinced that it was the sales skills of his people. Where we got it though, the real problem is he was letting his salespeople have whatever process they wanted to deal with to resolve objections and negotiate. They didn't have a predictable, scalable process. And if you just go off of charisma and skill, sometimes that might actually hurt your credibility. So let's think through these things a little bit. So let's look at the marketplace first. Most objections that we hear, and you do a lot of studies, usually in the market, you'll hear things about cost. The cost of doing something's too high, the cost of owning something's too high, and the argument from sales is the cost of not doing it might be just as high. Well, then value. What's interesting about value is perceived, right? Budget always seems, anytime somebody objects about budget, that always actually seems most legit, right? And budget's usually based off a past number. It usually is a time frame, and it usually means people are involved in the decision-making process. So budget is a decision-making process all in. That's a marketplace-driven rejection. And last thing's price, and price is the price. And what's interesting about capitalism is price is price is what's there regardless. The marketplace is an uncanny way of getting rid of products and services that don't meet standards. So that's where price comes in play. Now, as we look further into this, we have to have a predictable way that we look objections. So I'd write this down. This isn't in a slide. The question is, if we're just talking about objections today, in our next seminar, we're going to talk about negotiation. One of the things we need to ask ourselves is, hey, when is the best time to ever deal with an objection, right? And so your choices are when it comes up, after somebody says something. The best time to deal with an objection is before it ever comes up. That means it's baked into your process. My mentor, Sam Iorio, was the greatest at dealing with objections before it ever came up. He would often, in his speeches and in the way he would prep for things, he would bake comments in that would really, really in a way put a buyer on their heels a little bit. And I'm actually pulling a text up from one of these guys that used to work with him, and he used to say things. I'm going to read it to you real quick. I remember one time he was selling to a big I think it was a pharmaceutical company, and he said and I was sitting next to him, and before we started, he said to the decision makers, the senior management, he said, before I can get into how we help you, I need you to know what we're going to suggest is going to push your budget because it's something you didn't budget for. And it's going to be very inconvenient for your supervisors because they're going to have to because what we're suggesting is going to take them off the job site or off the production floor. And I looked at him, I go, oh my. But that one line dealing with that objection before it came up was unbelievably effective. See, but that's strategy, folks. But before you go there, you got to understand what was behind Sam's recommendation. So in my book, Selling's an Away Game, we actually talk about a very collapsible, predictable sales process, a sales process that probably fits in a lot of spots. I'm not saying this is your process, but hear me out. It actually follows It actually follows a visit to like an orthopedic surgeon or a dentist office. When you go to a dentist, a doctor, surgeon, you need to connect with somebody. They have credibility. They were suggested, they were referred to. You walk into a doctor's office and the nurse, nurse practitioner, assistant, whoever it is, PA, they then evaluate you, right? So the connect is they look at your insurance, they qualify you, who you are, name, all your contact information. That's the connect step. So you identify who you're going to deal with, the provider, then they verify who you are. Then when you actually get in the office, there's an evaluation done, nurse, nurse practitioner, whoever it is. Um, I have a couple people in my family. My niece Madison, she's going to be a nurse, and actually one of my son's girlfriends, she's going to be either a PA or a nurse too. So this is probably something they're going to do in their life, right? They evaluate. But then that evaluation's done, they confirm your past and they look to move to the future. Then the doc comes in and diagnoses you. Then from there, based off a wellness visit or sick visit, there's a prescription made. That's the evidence, that's the advice. And then after you get a prescription, so say you're going to get your shoulder done because you tore labrum, there's going to be a dialogue about the prescription, what PT you're going to get, what any painkillers, whatever it looks like, and you got to kind of debate back and forth with the doc, and then ultimately, right, you close and you advance it. Now, we call for a level first with objections. Before you get an objection of what they say after you pitch, there's another level of objections called inherent objections. They're actually built in and they're tied to each one of these steps. The goal is to have you understand them first. So we have a secondary sales process we teach inside of all our sales process called a balanced approach to selling. Okay. And if you look at 3 o'clock first, it takes into consideration the mindset of the buyer or the prospect. If you want to sell John Brown what John Brown buys, you got to see things through John Brown's eyes. So you got to see the inherent objection that you can deal with. Then there's a strategy tied to that. What are you trying to accomplish? Was the overarching goal, and then what tactics would you use and what skills would you need? So today, Brandon Lawrence on my team is one of our business or senior director of business development. Him and I are on a call with an executive in Major League Baseball. She was very lukewarm, if not cold at best. And if you got out of there, it really felt that we didn't establish credibility, but it was a cold call, right? So if we were going into her, if you look at that first connect step, right? Her mindset for us, she's preoccupied. We had to say or do something to get her over her preoccupation. She's probably asking herself, why the heck am I even meeting with these people? So I had to engage her, and Brandon and I both had to engage her in a conversation to get her to acknowledge that we're actually somebody worth listening to. There's the rapport and credibility. Were we able to move it to a next step? Yes. If you were reading the buying and warning signals, things she was doing, it seemed like a hell of a lot more warning signals than buying signals. So we had to employ tactics like good sales starters. We had to use impact statements where we were talking about other organizations we did business with. We had to facilitate the call. That's called a why speak statement. But the first objection is she's preoccupied. We need this when we're prospecting. We need this when we're opening calls, when we're presenting. We have to get our buyers, our audience over a level of preoccupation. That's inherent objection number one. Because remember, before we can talk about objections you get when you present, you got to know the inherent objections that are there. And that's why the sales process is there. Well, let's look at step 2. So back to the balance talk selling. If you look to the upper right of the screen, you'll see we're in the evaluate step. If you go to 3 o'clock, right, mindset is, of the buyer is I'm disinterested. So if you've ever asked a buyer questions in the beginning, they were pretty enthusiastic about answering your questions. And as you went forward, they stopped being enthusiastic and participating. It's probably because your questions weren't interesting. And by the way, yes, if anybody ever told you there's no bad question, there's no stupid question, that's a lie. There are stupid questions and there are bad questions. And especially if you're not thinking of your audience and you have that kind of EQ, that's an issue. So as you ask questions, you go through a needs assessment and opportunity analysis. The strategy would be ask questions for the buyer to paint a picture of their ideal scenario. Most salespeople ask questions. It's like leading the witness if you were in court. They ask questions that are good for them, not necessarily good for the buyer. Tactics, you got to understand the gap. Secondly, you got to create a the right environment for asking questions. And if you do want to be good at resolving objections or negotiating, facilitating is at play at all times. What skills do you need there? Well, you got to be a strategic thinker and an active listener. Well, let's kind of advance that a little bit. What would that look like? Well, what that would look like if I'm in that doctor's office, right? They're asking questions about my health. See, we're dealing with the level of disinterest. If they're asking questions about my health, how I feel, what my past is, I get over disinterest and become interested. And then they start talking to me about what my desired state is, where I want to go. Well, I become more interested. So I lead them to a gap. I hope that makes sense. So the first inherent objection is preoccupation. I got to get them interested. I got to get their attention. Or I got to get their attention over preoccupation. So I got to engage them, say, "Hey, I'm worth listening to." Right? I got to talk to them, and then I got to get them over disinterest. So I got to ask them questions to paint a picture. Let's move the needle. Let's go to the next inherent objection. So now we're at the diagnose step, right? Well, what's the mindset of the patient, the prospect, the customer? Well, I got to sell them. I got to get them comfortable. So if you were a doctor and you were literally trying to suggest somebody to do something for their health, to get an operation, to take a medicine, you got to get them comfortable with the suggestion. If you're any business, you're giving advice on getting somebody to change the way they do something through new technology. I know my finance team was starting to work with a new payroll system called Paycom, which we've done some business with. I'm pretty excited about them. Well, they had to get us very comfortable from the system we were on to their new system, and it's very different. And they had to get our finance team comfortable with the change. So the strategy here, okay, is to provide your best educated suggestion to bridge the gap. I was at the Buffalo Bills a couple weeks ago, and they were doing presentations on the new stadium, a group called Legends, and they were making suggestions on new seats and upsells and things like that. And I had all the salespeople kind of present. And I took one of the senior salespeople that I've known for a while. His name's Dustin Campbell. The guy's a stud. He's a great salesperson. I said, "Dustin, would you get up here and show everybody kind of what you do?" He's more than the seasoned people. And Dustin stands up and he literally said, "Based off of everything you've told me so far, I strongly recommend these seats in this section." It wasn't a choice. It was a hard recommendation, which forces the buyer to a corner. Sometimes people get comfortable because they're looking to you for confidence. With all this AI, all this evidence and third-party evidence is out there. Sometimes people are looking to you to provide the comfort. That's bedside manner with the doctor, right? People buy from people. People buy from people that like, trust, and respect. Sales isn't about moving a product or service. It's about moving people. What are the tactics? Well, you got to do what Dustin did. You have to have a specific interest statement based on what you're saying, right? Here's what we recommend. Skills. Understand motives and absolutes and create urgency. Boy, Dustin did that in front of 50 people last week. Well, you also, if you're going to do that, you have to understand your buyers. So there's a lot of different sales processes here. Do you have how do you do that with a financial buyer? How do you do that with a user buyer? How do you do that with an executive and a technical buyer? What does that look like? So you have to understand your audience. A couple more. Also motivation, right? Everybody operates, whether they're buying something, they're operating in an organization, they operate a little bit off of what we call Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, who are we selling? Are we selling something that will provide safety or belonging or survival in business, what it is? So these are things to take into consideration as you're trying to drive comfort. Now we have 3 inherent objections so far. We have preoccupation, we have disinterest, we have comfort that we have to overcome. Let's look at the last few before we bring this down for a landing. Well, let's go back to that next step in that doctor's process, right? We are trying to remove doubt. So we're at the prescribe part. We have to evidence removes doubt. Our strategy is to present in a way the buyer sees value in the solution or opportunity. What are our tactics? Well, we got to deliver with different forms of evidence. We probably have to trial close, which I reminded you of before, is an opinion asking question, and we have to make a prescription or prescribe a solution. What are the skills? We got to appeal to different people. We got to use verbal brevity, persuasion, and influence. We got to dramatize our ideas, right? So that's what we're doing in that process. Now, what we actually call for, right, the next inherent objection actually now ties into a part where we have to have dialogue. This is actually the natural part where salespeople typically wait for the objection. Now, if you go back to my example with Sam, the best time to deal with objection before it comes up. The second best time to deal with an objection is the moment you get it. But what you should do is you should ask for it. So it should be a part of your sales processes where you're asking what's holding them back. So it's what are some things you really like? What are some things you don't like? Um, I have a lot of salespeople ask things. What do you hate about what I presented you? Use a very strong word, and they actually the buyer from an influence standpoint and persuasion standpoint would say, "I don't hate this. I don't like it or not comfortable." But you got to give this spot where you're going to dialogue so you can clarify. But it really exceptional salespeople bring out objections. Now you're trying to deal with doubt, right? Let's go to the next step, which is the dialogue step, right? So go to 3 o'clock, right? Everybody you pitch is going to procrastinate. Okay. So you have to overcome that inherent objection. So the strategy is if they're procrastinating for a reason. It's a specific procrastination: time, price, cost, value. So you need to be able to deal with that, right? So write this down: an objection stated is better than an objection assumed. Most salespeople that we coach, and we're talking to them, they'll say, "Hey, you ask how the meeting was. How was their last sales meeting?" They'll say, "It was great." "You think you're going to get it?" "I am." "What do you think the objection is going to be?" "Well, I think it's this." Rarely does the sales. I'm not saying they shouldn't guess. They shouldn't have instinct. I think they should, but rarely do they actually ask for the objection. So what are our tactics here? Well, we got to get first, because this is the step that starts to negotiation. We got to get people to defend, define, and explain. That's DDE. We got to categorize objections. We got to smoke out hidden objections. Many times the first objection somebody gets isn't the real objection, it's the one that sits behind it. And then we got to paint word pictures. What skills do we need? We've got to create urgency. We got to facilitate dialogue, and we got to build healthy tension. Now let's go to the last thing, and then we're going to open this up for some questions. DDE is define, defend, and explain. So we get an objection. The buyer has to define, defend, and explain. That's one of the tactics. We got to be able to categorize objections when we get them. Are they putting us off? Is it genuine? Is it misconception? And then are they is what they're saying biased or half baked, right? So last step before the questions is you get to the close. What's the mindset at 3 o'clock? Well, the buyer's at indecision, right? They procrastinate, then they're at indecision. What's the strategy with closing? There's no skill in closing. Just do it. Ask for the order. Tactics. You should know several forms of how to close. Minor point, next step, direct method. And what's the skills? Well, it's usually confidence. So let's think of these inherent objections as a first part of getting to another level. There's objections to the sales process: preoccupation, disinterest, doubt, comfort, procrastination, and indecision. So let's look at it as our first step. And then from there, we'll go into how to really tactically deal with the price objection, the cost and value, and then get into negotiation next time we're together. Who has the first question? Hopefully there's a couple of questions out there. Sometimes people get a little quiet on these things. This will be recorded so you can go back to it. So Chip, what do you have?
Yeah, I got a couple of questions here. Let's see. First one is, what are some of the most common objections that salespeople have to deal with, and what are some good strategies for dealing with them?
Well, number one is you always hear price objection. It's some kind of financial objection in every industry, without a shadow of doubt. Usually that's where term objections come from, and things like that. That's most common. I would make I think our first move that we suggest right out of the bat when you do get an objection is somebody says, "Hey, I'm really concerned about your price." Well, um, you got to get there first. So you probably have to ask a closing question before that and say, what are your thoughts on moving forward? And somebody said, "Well, I have some concerns. What are they?" "Well, I'm a little concerned about the price." The clarifying question there is it more price or value you're concerned with? And depending how they answer that, they say, it might be a little bit more value. Okay, well, how would you define value, or how would you define price? So that's actually a first step that we would definitely suggest there. But usually a financial objections tip the most typical. What other questions, Chip?
Yeah, we got another one here. Lance mentioned earlier it is possible to close a deal if a potential client does not want to negotiate. What would be the best approach if someone quickly jumps to the negotiation step, but you feel there may be some objections that have not been uncovered or discussed? Do you allow the conversation to flow and begin to negotiate, pause the conversation, and address any potential objections?
Well, I would say I would probably say something where they jump to a negotiation is number one. I would ask that seller what's indicating that they're jumping to a negotiation. Are they asking for a better deal off the bat? And I would say something if somebody said, "Well, yeah, I would," you know, I'm concerned about price. You're gonna have to make the price better. And so, say I was selling $100,000 product, and they start pushing back, and I sensed maybe they were trying to negotiate the price. I may say some, "Hey, I'm kind of curious. It seems like you have some sensitivity to the investment or the price." And I said, "That's right. Well, I'm kind of curious, and there's probably nothing I can do with price at all. But if you were going to put a price tag on this, what would you put it at?" And say they just came back and said, "Well, I put $75,000 on it." And they might think they're negotiating, but see, I'm not negotiating there, because what I want to say is to them is, okay, so we have this price, it's 100,000, and you think you're saying 75,000. Well, it sounds like you see 75% of the value. Is that right? Just before we even start anything, I want to make sure you see what the value is. And they said, "Well, yeah, I guess that's right." And then I would say, "Okay, based off what we presented you, if you were me, what would you take out of this to get closer to 75,000?" And if they said nothing, I know they were playing hardcore. So we're off 25% of the value. As a business or a salespeople, you have to decide if the juice is worth the squeeze there. Do you have any kind of move there? So that's a quick answer without with building a quick example, not knowing what the indicators you have in your mind. What are some other questions?
Yeah, we have time for probably a couple more. Another question came in. Lance, what are the 6 ways to close?
It's a good question. Well, what we call for, and this is probably a good plug for Selling as an Away Game. If you pick up that book, and by the way, it's called Selling as an Away Game because it happens in the mind of the buyer. I would say one is the direct method, kind of like the Nike close, right? So just do it. Ask for the order. Something like, "What are your thoughts moving forward?" The second step would be like an alternate choice close. Are you more interested in A or B? The third would be like a next step close, right? Um, you look beyond the step where, our salespeople do it sometimes where, hey, if you were going to actually do the training or consulting, who'd be the person that would quarterback this, or where would the location be? So that's the third one. Then you kind of have an opportunity close, right? Um, which is a little bit more like, Amazon does it a lot. QVC used to do it a lot. Um, Let me think. Kmart used to do a lot. Welcome Kmart shoppers. We have toilet paper on sale for 45 cents a roll for the next 10 minutes. It's like a blue light special, right? Like there were the blue lights that they would go off in the aisles. So that's an opportunity close. Essentially, if you do this in a certain amount of time, if you take advantage of this deal now in this window, you can get a discount or something like that. That's an opportunity close. Then you have like a minor point close. I remember the first time I ever bought season tickets to the Cleveland Cavaliers. I'm from Philly, so I wasn't necessarily a Cleveland Cavalier fan, but it was actually pre LeBron too, believe it or not. So, and I had a salesperson, probably one of the best salespeople I ever met. His name's Bob Civic. I think he's in the health and wellness business now, but he was in pro sports sales for a while. And he was showing me this really nice area. And he goes, "What do you think?" I go, "I like him." And he goes, "Like him enough to buy?" I said, "It kind of depends. I goes, "Where you at?" And he goes, "Well, hey, before we even talk, the investment," he goes, "The four seats we're looking at, you can get or customers put their names on the seats." He goes, and there was these little placards on the seat. And he started to show me. I'm like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." He goes, "Do you want your company's name on the seats or your personal name?" I'm like, "Oh, Bob, that's a great question." I completely sucked into it, right? I'm like, "I think I'd like my company's name on it." Well, as soon as I said that, he had me, right? As a minor point, you make a minor point indicating that a major decisions on the way. And the last one's kind of what we call weighing or a balancing close. It's what Ben Franklin talks about in um, his autobiography. I teach my son this. I can remember my son Zach was choosing colleges, and he plays some pro hockey now. He was literally, he does pros and cons all the time, right? You make like a T chart. What are the pluses and minuses here? What are the or if you look at it from a weighing side, right? Like you got feathers and rocks, so you could have more feathers and less rocks, but one weighs more than the other. And I think most people, when they do make a decision, especially B2B or anything else, they do some kind of pro con list plus minus. So that would be the sixth one.
Excellent. Well, we're up against time. Thank you for answering that question, Lance. And thanks everyone for
Certainly.
joining today. We will be sending out an email invite for part 2 of this webinar. So if you have any other questions, you can definitely join us in part 2. It's going to be on July 23rd, 1 p.m. Eastern. So be on the lookout for that. Until then, thanks everybody for joining us.
Appreciate everybody's time today. Thanks, Chip.